The cabin of the business class was filled with an air of quiet sophistication. The soft hum of the engines blended seamlessly with the faint clinking of glasses as the flight attendants moved gracefully between the rows, serving champagne to the passengers. The seats were spacious, the lighting dimmed to a warm glow, and the passengers, dressed in tailored suits and designer dresses, exuded an aura of wealth and success. This was a space reserved for the elite, a sanctuary of luxury high above the clouds. Among the passengers, a woman in her early 70s entered the cabin. Her presence was unassuming, yet it drew attention almost immediately. She was small in stature, her back slightly hunched with age, and she carried a modest handbag that had clearly seen better days. Her outfit, a traditional long dress or aodai in faded blue, stood out starkly against the polished modern attire of the other passengers. The fabric of her dress was worn, the edges frayed, and the colours had dulled with time, yet there was something about her demeanour, calm, composed, and quietly dignified, that made her stand out in a way that was hard to ignore. As she walked down the aisle, a few passengers exchanged glances. Some were curious, others dismissive. A man in a sharp navy suit, Mr. Richard, raised an eyebrow and muttered something under his breath to the woman seated next to him, Miss Sophia, who chuckled softly. The woman, Mrs. Evelyn, seemed oblivious to the whispers and the subtle judgment in the air. She clutched her boarding pass tightly in her hand and made her way to her assigned seat. Standing nearby was Anna, one of the flight attendants assigned to the business class cabin. Anna was in her late 20s, with striking features and a confident air about her. She had been working for the airline for 3 years and took great pride in her appearance and professionalism. Her uniform was immaculate, her hair perfectly styled, and her smile, though practiced, was warm enough to charm even the most demanding passengers. However, beneath her polished exterior, Anna harbored a certain arrogance. She believed that the business class was a space reserved for those who belonged, the wealthy, the powerful, and the impeccably dressed. To her, appearances mattered, and first impressions were everything. When Anna noticed Mrs. Evelyn, her smile faltered for a brief moment. She quickly scanned the woman from head to toe, her eyes lingering on the faded aodai and the scuffed edges of her handbag. Something about the woman didn't sit right with her. She didn't look like the typical business class passenger Anna was used to serving. In fact, she looked completely out of place. Anna approached Mrs. Evelyn with a polite but firm tone. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her voice carrying a hint of condescension.
This is the business class cabin.
"May I see your boarding pass?" Mrs. Evelyn stopped in her tracks and looked up at Anna. Her expression remained calm, her eyes steady. Without a word, she handed over her boarding pass. Anna took it and glanced at the details, her brow furrowing slightly. The seat number matched, but something about the situation still didn't feel right to her. She hesitated for a moment before handing the pass back. "Ma'am," Anna continued, her tone now more direct, "are you sure this is your seat? Business class is reserved for passengers with premium tickets. Perhaps you're mistaken and your seat is in the economy cabin." Mrs. Evelyn's hands trembled slightly as she took back the boarding pass, but her voice was steady when she replied, "This is my seat. I believe there's no mistake." Anna's lips pressed into a thin line. She wasn't convinced. The woman's appearance didn't align with her expectations of a business-class passenger, and Anna couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She decided to press further. "Ma'am," Anna said, her voice now louder, drawing the attention of nearby passengers, "I need to confirm this. Business class has certain standards, and I'm afraid," she paused, her eyes flicking to the woman's aodai, "this doesn't seem to be the right place for you." The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. A few passengers turned their heads, their curiosity piqued. Mr. Richard smirked, leaning back in his seat as if waiting for some entertainment. Miss Sophia whispered something to him and they both chuckled quietly. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted, a subtle tension building as more eyes turned toward Mrs. Evelyn. Mrs. Evelyn remained silent. Her hands gripped the strap of her handbag tightly, her knuckles turning white. Yet her expression didn't waver. She looked directly at Anna, her gaze calm but unwavering. as if she had faced far greater challenges in her life than the judgment of a flight attendant. Anna, however, mistook the woman's silence for defiance. She crossed her arms and took a step back, her voice now tinged with irritation. "Ma'am, if you don't cooperate, I'll have to call the captain to resolve this matter. I'm sure you understand that we have rules to maintain the standards of this cabin." The murmurs among the passengers grew louder. A few people pulled out their phones, discreetly recording the interaction. The tension in the cabin was palpable, and yet Mrs. Evelyn didn't move. She stood her ground, her calm demeanor contrasting sharply with Anna's growing frustration. Finally, Mrs. Evelyn spoke, her voice soft but firm.
"I am sitting in the seat assigned to me. If there's an issue, you may call the captain."
Her words were simple, but there was a quiet authority in her tone that made Anna hesitate. For a brief moment, Anna felt a flicker of doubt, but her pride wouldn't allow her to back down. She turned on her heel and marched toward the intercom to call Captain John, determined to prove that she was right. As Anna walked away, the cabin buzzed with whispers. Some passengers looked at Mrs. Evelyn with pity, others with disdain. Mr. Richard shook his head and muttered, "What a waste of time." Miss Sophia smirked and said, "She doesn't belong here. Just look at her." Mrs. Evelyn, however, remained standing. Her hands trembled slightly, but her gaze was steady. She adjusted the strap of her handbag and took a deep breath, her expression unreadable. She had faced judgment before, and she knew how to endure it. But this time, she wasn't just enduring, she was waiting. And as the cabin waited with bated breath for the captain to arrive, no one could have predicted the storm that was about to unfold. Anna's heels clicked sharply against the polished floor of the cabin as she strode toward the intercom at the back of the business class section. Her face was set in a determined expression, her lips pressed into a thin line. She was certain she was doing the right thing. After all, it was her job to maintain the standards of the business class cabin. To her, Mrs. Evelyn's presence, with her outdated attire and unassuming demeanor, was a disruption to the carefully curated image of luxury that the airline prided itself on. As Anna reached the intercom, she glanced back at Mrs. Evelyn, who was still standing quietly by her seat. The older woman's calmness only fueled Anna's frustration. "She's just being stubborn," Anna muttered under her breath as she picked up the receiver and called the cockpit. "Captain John," she said, her voice steady but tinged with irritation. "We have a situation in the business class cabin. There's a passenger who appears to be sitting in the wrong seat, and she's refusing to move. I've asked her multiple times, but she's not cooperating. Could you come and assist?" There was a brief pause on the other end before Captain John's deep, measured voice came through. "I'll be there shortly. Stay calm and ensure the situation doesn't escalate." Anna hung up the receiver and took a deep breath, smoothing her uniform. She turned back toward the cabin, her eyes scanning the passengers. Many of them were now openly watching the scene unfold, their curiosity piqued. Some had their phones out, discreetly recording the interaction, while others whispered among themselves. At the center of it all, Mrs. Evelyn stood quietly, her hands clasped in front of her. Her posture was relaxed, but there was a quiet strength in the way she held herself. She didn't look around or acknowledge the stares. Instead, she kept her gaze fixed on the seat in front of her, as if she were waiting for something or someone. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Whispers rippled through the rows of seats as passengers speculated about what was happening. Why is this taking so long? Mr. Richard, the man in the navy suit, muttered to Miss Sophia, who was seated beside him. He leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms with an air of impatience. If she doesn't belong here, just move her already. This is ridiculous. Miss Sophia, a woman in her early 40s with perfectly styled hair and a designer handbag resting on her lap, smirked. I agree, look at her, she said, her voice low but dripping with disdain. That dress looks like it's from another century. She's probably trying to sneak into business class for the free champagne. A few rows away, a younger passenger, a woman in her 20s named Emily, frowned as she listened to the comments. Unlike the others, Emily felt a pang of discomfort at the way Mrs. Evelyn was being treated. She glanced at the older woman, who remained silent and composed despite the growing hostility around her. Maybe she does belong here, Emily whispered to her seatmate. a man in his 30s who shrugged dismissively.
"She has a boarding pass, doesn't she?"
"Who knows," the man replied, "but she doesn't look like she fits in. That's the problem."
Emily bit her lip, torn between speaking up and staying silent. She didn't want to draw attention to herself, but something about the situation didn't sit right with her.
Anna returned to Mrs. Evelyn, her expression firm.
"The captain is on his way," she said, her voice loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. "Once he arrives, we'll get this sorted out. In the meantime, I suggest you take a seat in the economy cabin until we can confirm your ticket."
Mrs. Evelyn looked up at Anna, her expression calm but resolute.
"I've already shown you my ticket," she said softly.
"This is my assigned seat."
Anna's patience was wearing thin. She crossed her arms and leaned slightly forward, her tone growing sharper.
"Ma'am, I'm trying to be polite here, but you're making this more difficult than it needs to be. If you don't cooperate, I'll have no choice but to escalate this further." Mrs. Evelyn didn't flinch. Her gaze remained steady, and her voice, though quiet, carried a weight that made Anna hesitate. "I am not making this difficult," she said. "I'm simply sitting in the seat I paid for. If you believe there's an issue, you're welcome to address it with the captain."
Anna opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, a voice from one of the nearby seats interrupted her.
"Excuse me," Emily said, her voice tentative but clear. She'd finally decided to speak up. "I don't mean to interfere, but if she has a boarding pass for this seat, shouldn't that be enough? Why are you treating her like she doesn't belong here?" All eyes turned to Emily and a hush fell over the cabin. Anna's cheeks flushed slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. "I appreciate your concern," she said, her tone clipped, "but this is a matter of protocol. I'm simply ensuring that all passengers are seated correctly." Emily didn't back down.
"It just seems like you're making a lot of assumptions based on how she looks," she said.
"That doesn't seem fair."
Anna's jaw tightened, but before she could respond, the sound of the cockpit door opening drew everyone's attention.
Captain John stepped into the cabin, his tall frame and authoritative presence immediately commanding respect. Captain John walked down the aisle with measured steps, his expression calm but serious. He had been briefed on the situation by Anna, but as he approached Mrs. Evelyn, he took a moment to assess the scene for himself. The tension in the cabin was almost tangible, and he could feel the weight of dozens of eyes watching his every move. "Good afternoon," he said, his deep voice cutting through the silence. "I understand there's been some confusion about seating arrangements. Let's get this resolved quickly." Anna stepped forward, her posture straight and professional. "Captain, this passenger is claiming that this is her seat, but I believe there's been a mistake. I've asked her to move to the economy cabin, but she's refusing." Captain John turned to Mrs. Evelyn, his expression neutral. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass, please?" Mrs. Evelyn reached into her handbag and pulled out the crumpled boarding pass. Her hands trembled slightly as she handed it to the captain, but her gaze remained steady. Captain John took the pass and examined it carefully. As his eyes scanned the details, his brow furrowed slightly. Then suddenly his expression changed. His eyes widened, and a flicker of recognition crossed his face. He looked up at Mrs. Evelyn, then back at the boarding pass, as if double-checking to make sure he wasn't mistaken. A heavy silence fell over the cabin as Captain John straightened his posture and handed the boarding pass back to Mrs. Evelyn. When he spoke, his voice was quieter, almost reverent. "Mrs. Evelyn," he said, I didn't realize you were on this flight. Please accept my apologies for the misunderstanding." Anna blinked, her confident demeanor faltering. "Captain," she said, her voice uncertain, "is everything all right?" Captain John turned to Anna, his expression now stern. "Anna," he said, his tone firm, "this is Mrs. Evelyn. She is the founder of this airline." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. For a moment, no one moved. The passengers who had been watching with amusement now looked stunned, their expressions shifting from curiosity to shock. Mr. Richard's smirk disappeared, and Miss Sophia's face turned pale. Emily, who had spoken up earlier, looked at Mrs. Evelyn with newfound respect. Anna, meanwhile, felt the blood drain from her face. Her mouth opened and closed as she struggled to process what she had just heard. I didn't know," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper.
I didn't realize." Mrs. Evelyn looked at Anna, her expression calm but unreadable. "You didn't know who I was," she said softly. "But does that excuse the way you treated me?" Anna's face turned red, and she looked down, unable to meet Mrs. Evelyn's gaze. The weight of her actions was beginning to sink in, and for the first time she felt a pang of genuine regret. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted dramatically. The passengers who had been whispering and laughing earlier now sat in uncomfortable silence, their faces a mix of embarrassment and shame. Some of them avoided looking at Mrs. Evelyn altogether, while others glanced at her with a newfound sense of respect. Emily, who had defended Mrs. Evelyn earlier, felt a surge of vindication. She gave the older woman a small, encouraging smile, which Mrs. Evelyn acknowledged with a slight nod. Captain John turned to the passengers and addressed them directly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice steady, "I'd like to remind everyone that all passengers, regardless of their appearance, deserve to be treated with respect. This situation should never have escalated to this point, and for that I apologize on behalf of the crew." The passengers murmured their agreement, though many of them looked uncomfortable. As Captain John returned to the cockpit, the cabin fell into an uneasy silence. Anna stood frozen in place, her mind racing as she replayed the events of the past few minutes. She had made a terrible mistake and she knew it, but the full consequences of her actions were yet to come. Mrs. Evelyn, meanwhile, took her seat and adjusted her handbag on her lap. Her expression was calm, but her eyes held a quiet intensity. She had endured the judgment and disrespect of others before, but this time, she wasn't just enduring, she was preparing to teach a lesson that no one on this flight would forget. The cabin remained eerily quiet after Captain John's departure. The weight of his words lingered in the air, and the passengers who had been so quick to judge and whisper moments ago now sat in awkward silence. Anna stood frozen near the aisle, her face pale and her hands trembling slightly. She had never felt so exposed, so utterly humiliated. The realization of her mistake hit her like a tidal wave, and she struggled to keep her composure. Mrs. Evelyn, now seated in her assigned seat, adjusted her handbag on her lap and looked out the window. Her expression was calm, but there was a quiet strength in her demeanor that made it clear she was not someone to be underestimated. She had endured the judgment and condescension of others before, but this time she knew she had an opportunity to make a point, not just for herself, but for everyone in the cabin. Anna finally found the courage to approach Mrs. Evelyn. Her steps were hesitant, and her usual confidence was nowhere to be seen. She stopped a few feet away, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Evelyn," she began, her tone shaky, I want to apologize. I didn't know who you were, and Mrs. Evelyn turned to face her, her gaze steady and piercing. "You didn't know who I was," she said, her voice soft but firm. "And that's exactly the problem." Anna blinked, confused. I don't understand." Mrs. Evelyn leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on the armrests of her seat. "You didn't know who I was, so you assumed I didn't belong here. You judged me based on my appearance, on the clothes I wear, on the way I carry myself. Tell me, Anna, if I were not the founder of this airline, would your behavior toward me have been acceptable?" Anna opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She looked down at her hands, her cheeks burning with shame. She had no defense, no justification for her actions. Mrs. Evelyn continued, her voice calm but filled with quiet authority. "Respect is not something you give only to those you think are important. It is not reserved for the wealthy, the powerful, or the well-dressed. Respect is a basic human right, something that every person deserves, regardless of their appearance or status. Do you understand that?" Anna nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Yes, ma'am," she whispered. "I understand. I was wrong." Mrs. Evelyn studied her for a moment, then leaned back in her seat. "Good," she said simply. "Acknowledging your mistake is the first step. But understanding why you made that mistake and ensuring you don't repeat it is just as important." The exchange between Mrs. Evelyn and Anna had not gone unnoticed by the other passengers. Many of them shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their earlier amusement and judgment now replaced by guilt. Mr. Richard,
who had been one of the most vocal critics of Mrs. Evelyn, cleared his throat awkwardly and avoided making eye contact with anyone. Miss Sophia, who had laughed at Anna's remarks earlier, now sat stiffly in her seat, her face flushed with embarrassment. Emily, the young woman who had spoken up in defense of Mrs. Evelyn earlier, felt a surge of vindication. She glanced at Mrs. Evelyn and gave her a small, encouraging smile. Mrs. Evelyn noticed and nodded slightly in acknowledgement, a faint smile playing on her lips. One by one, the passengers began to reflect on their own behaviour. They had all been so quick to judge, so eager to assume the worst about Mrs. Evelyn, simply because she didn't fit their preconceived notions of what a business-class passenger should look like. And now, faced with the truth of who she was, they couldn't help but feel ashamed. Mrs. Evelyn turned her attention to the cabin as a whole. She could feel the weight of the passengers' stares, the unspoken apologies in their eyes. She decided it was time to address the room, not to scold or humiliate, but to teach. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice calm but carrying a quiet authority that commanded attention. "I'd like to take a moment to share something with you. I've spent my entire life building this airline, not just as a business, but as a symbol of what I believe in: dignity, respect, and equality. When I started this company, I didn't have much. I worked hard, faced countless challenges, and endured more judgment and discrimination than I care to remember. But through it all, I held on to one belief: that every person, no matter who they are or where they come from, deserves to be treated with respect." She paused, letting her words sink in. The passengers listened intently, their earlier discomfort now replaced by genuine interest. "Today," she continued, "I was reminded of how easy it is for people to judge others based on appearances. I was judged because of the clothes I wear, because I don't fit the image of what some people think a business-class passenger should look like. But let me ask you this: what does it mean to belong? Is it about wealth, status, appearance, or is it about something deeper? About character? About the way we treat one another?" Her gaze swept across the cabin, meeting the eyes of several passengers. "I hope that today we can all take a moment to reflect on our own biases, our own assumptions. Because the truth is, respect is not something you earn by wearing a suit or carrying a designer bag. It is something you give freely because it is the right thing to do." Anna stood silently, her head bowed as she listened to Mrs. Evelyn's words. Each sentence felt like a dagger to her heart, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. She had been so focused on maintaining the standards of the business-class cabin that she had forgotten the most important standard of all: treating people with kindness and respect. When Mrs. Evelyn finished speaking, Anna took a deep breath and stepped forward. Her voice was steady, but there was a vulnerability in her tone that hadn't been there before. "Mrs. Evelyn," she said, "I want to thank you for what you just said. You're right, I made assumptions about you that I had no right to make. I let my own biases cloud my judgment, and I treated you in a way that was completely unacceptable. I'm truly sorry." Mrs. Evelyn regarded her for a moment, then nodded. "Apology accepted," she said. "But remember, Anna, words are only the beginning. It's your actions that will show whether you've truly learned from this experience." Anna nodded, her resolve strengthening. "I promise I'll do better. I'll make sure this never happens again." The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted once again, but this time it was different. The tension and judgment that had filled the air earlier were gone, replaced by a sense of humility and reflection. The passengers, who had been so quick to judge Mrs. Evelyn, now looked at her with a newfound respect. Not because of her status as the founder of the airline, but because of the wisdom and grace she had shown in handling the situation. As the flight continued, the cabin grew quieter. Some passengers returned to their books or laptops, while others stared out the window, lost in thought. Emily, who had been one of the few to defend Mrs. Evelyn from the beginning, felt a sense of pride. She had stood up for what was right, and now she felt validated. Mrs. Evelyn, meanwhile, leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes. She wasn't angry or upset, she was simply tired, but as she rested, she felt a sense of satisfaction. She had turned a moment of judgment and disrespect into an opportunity for growth. Not just for Anna, but for everyone in the cabin.
The flight landed smoothly, but the events that had unfolded in the business class cabin lingered in the minds of everyone on board. As the passengers disembarked, many avoided eye contact with Mrs. Evelyn, their earlier judgment and whispers now replaced by a heavy sense of guilt. Some offered her small apologetic smiles, but Mrs. Evelyn, ever composed, simply nodded politely in return. She carried herself with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout the ordeal, her presence a reminder of the lesson she had imparted. Anna, however, was not as composed. She stood near the exit, her usual confident smile replaced by a strained expression. She greeted passengers as they left, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the flight over and over again. She couldn't shake the image of Mrs. Evelyn's calm yet piercing gaze, the weight of her words still pressing heavily on her chest. When Mrs. Evelyn approached the exit, Anna straightened her posture, her heart pounding. She knew she had to say something, but the words caught in her throat. As Mrs. Evelyn passed, Anna managed to stammer, "Thank you, Mrs. Evelyn. I'll do better." Mrs. Evelyn paused for a moment, her eyes meeting Anna's. There was no anger in her gaze, only a quiet understanding. "I hope you will," she said simply, before continuing down the jet bridge. Her words were not harsh, but they carried a weight that Anna couldn't ignore. The next day, Anna was called into a meeting with her supervisor and Captain John. She had barely slept the night before, her mind consumed with worry about the consequences of her actions. As she sat in the small conference room, her hands fidgeting nervously in her lap, she braced herself for the worst. Captain John was the first to speak. "Anna," he began, his tone firm but not unkind, "what happened on yesterday's flight was unacceptable. As a flight attendant, your job is not just to enforce rules, but to ensure that every passenger feels respected and valued. You failed to do that." Anna nodded, her throat tight. "I know, Captain," she said quietly. "I made a terrible mistake. I let my assumptions and biases cloud my judgment, and I treated Mrs. Evelyn in a way that was completely unprofessional. I'm deeply sorry." Her supervisor, a woman named Claire, leaned forward. "Anna, we've reviewed the incident, and while we appreciate your acknowledgement of your mistake, this is a serious matter. Mrs. Evelyn is not just any passenger, she's the founder of this airline, but even if she weren't, your behavior would still be unacceptable. We expect our staff to treat every passenger with respect, regardless of their appearance or status." Anna felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away. "I understand," she said. "I take full responsibility for my actions, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this right." Claire exchanged a glance with Captain John before. Continuing, "We've decided to suspend you from active duty for 2 weeks. During this time, you'll be required to attend a series of training sessions on customer service, diversity and bias awareness. Additionally, we expect you to write a formal apology to Mrs. Evelyn." Anna nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for giving me the chance to learn from this. I won't let it happen again." During her suspension, Anna threw herself into the training sessions with a determination she hadn't felt in years. The sessions were eye-opening, forcing her to confront her own biases and assumptions. She learned about the importance of empathy, the dangers of stereotyping, and the value of treating every individual with dignity and respect. One of the most impactful moments came during a workshop on unconscious bias. The instructor asked the participants to reflect on a time when they had been judged unfairly and to consider how it had made them feel. For Anna, the memory was immediate, her first day as a flight attendant. She had been nervous and eager to prove herself. But a senior colleague had dismissed her as just another pretty face who wouldn't last in the industry. The sting of that judgment had stayed with her for years, and now she realized with painful clarity that she had done the same thing to Mrs. Evelyn. As the days passed, Anna began to see her mistake not just as a failure of professionalism, but as a failure of character. She had prided herself on her ability to maintain high standards in the business class cabin, but she had forgotten the most important standard of all, kindness. At the end of her suspension, Anna sat down to write her formal apology to Mrs. Evelyn. She spent hours crafting the letter, pouring her heart into every word. She didn't just apologize for her actions, she acknowledged the deeper issues that had led to them and expressed her commitment to change. The letter read, "Greater than dear Mrs. Evelyn, greater than I am writing to express my deepest apologies for the way I treated you on flight 237. My behavior was unprofessional, disrespectful, and completely unacceptable. I made assumptions about you based on your appearance, and in doing so, I failed to uphold the values of respect and dignity that this airline stands for. Greater than your words during the flight had a profound impact on me. They forced me to confront my own biases and to reflect on the kind of person I want to be, not just as a flight attendant, but as a human being. I am truly sorry for the pain and discomfort I caused you, and I want you to know that I am committed to learning from this experience and ensuring that it never happens again. Greater than thank you for your grace and patience in handling the situation. You turned what could have been a moment of anger into a powerful lesson. Not just for me, but for everyone on that flight. I will carry that lesson with me for the rest of my life. Greater than sincerely, greater than Anna." After sending the letter, Anna felt a sense of relief, but also a renewed sense of responsibility. She knew that words alone were not enough. She had to prove through her actions that she had truly changed. A week later, Anna received an unexpected invitation to meet with Mrs. Evelyn at the airline's headquarters. Nervous but determined, she arrived early, her heart pounding as she waited in the sleek modern lobby. When Mrs. Evelyn entered the room, Anna stood immediately, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Mrs. Evelyn," she began, "thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Mrs. Evelyn held up a hand, a small smile on her face. "Sit down, Anna," she said gently. "Let's talk." For the next hour, the two women spoke candidly. Anna shared her journey of self-reflection, her experiences during the training sessions, and her commitment to becoming a better person. Mrs. Evelyn listened patiently, her expression thoughtful. When Anna finished, Mrs. Evelyn leaned forward, her gaze steady. "Anna," she said, "we all make mistakes. What matters is how we respond to them. I can see that you've taken this experience to heart, and I respect your willingness to learn and grow. But remember, this is just the beginning. True change takes time and consistent effort." Anna nodded, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Evelyn. I promise I won't let you down." In the months that followed, Anna returned to work with a renewed sense of purpose. She became an advocate for kindness and respect, sharing her story with her colleagues and encouraging them to reflect on their own biases. She volunteered to mentor new flight attendants, emphasizing the importance of empathy and understanding in their interactions with passengers. For Anna, the experience had been humbling, but it had also been transformative. She had learned that respect was not just a professional obligation. It was a fundamental human value, one that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. And for Mrs. Evelyn, the incident served as a reminder of why she had built the airline in the first place: to create a space where everyone, regardless of their background or appearance, could feel valued and respected. Months had passed since the flight that had sparked a profound transformation, not just for Anna, but for everyone involved. The incident had become a quiet but impactful story within the airline, shared among staff as a reminder of the values the company stood for. For Mrs. Evelyn, it was a moment that reaffirmed her lifelong mission to build an airline that wasn't just about luxury or efficiency, but about humanity. For Anna, it marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life, one defined by growth, humility, and a deeper understanding of what it truly meant to serve others. Anna had returned to her role as a flight attendant with a renewed sense of purpose. The suspension and training had been a humbling experience, but it had also been a gift, a chance to reflect on her actions and grow from them. She no longer saw her job as simply enforcing rules or maintaining the image of the business class cabin. Instead, she saw it as an opportunity to connect with people, to make their journeys a little brighter, and to treat every passenger with the respect and kindness they deserved. Her interactions with passengers changed dramatically. She no longer judged them by their appearances or made assumptions about who they were. Instead, She approached each person with an open mind and a genuine desire to make them feel welcome. Whether it was a businessman in a tailored suit or a grandmother in a simple dress, Anna treated them all with the same warmth and professionalism. One day during a routine flight, a passenger in economy class stopped Anna as she walked down the aisle. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice hesitant. "I just wanted to say thank you. You've been so kind and attentive. It's rare to see that these days." Anna smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you for saying that," she replied. "It means a lot to me." Moments like these reminded Anna of why she had chosen this career in the first place. It wasn't about the prestige of working in business class or the perks of traveling the world. It was about the people. And now more than ever, she was determined to make a difference, one passenger at a time. For Mrs. Evelyn, the incident on the flight had been a powerful reminder of the work that still needed to be done. She had spent decades building the airline from the ground up, pouring her heart and soul into creating a company that reflected her values. But she knew that no matter how much progress had been made, there was always room for improvement. After the flight, Mrs. Evelyn had a series of meetings with the airline's leadership team. She shared her experience and emphasized the importance of fostering a culture of respect and inclusivity at every level of the organization. "It's not enough to have policies in place," she told them. "We need to ensure that every employee, from the ground crew to the flight attendants to the executives, understands and embodies our values. Respect isn't just a slogan, it's a way of life." Under her guidance, the airline launched a new initiative called The Human Connection. The program focused on training employees to recognize and overcome their biases, to treat every passenger with dignity, and to create a more inclusive and welcoming environment. It also included workshops, mentorship programs, and opportunities for employees to share their own stories and experiences. The initiative was met with overwhelming support from employees and passengers alike. It became a cornerstone of the airline's identity, setting it apart from competitors and earning it a reputation as not just a leader in luxury travel, but a leader in compassion and humanity. One day, several months after the flight, Anna found herself assigned to a new route, a long-haul flight to Paris. As she prepared the cabin for boarding, she couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement. Paris had always been one of her favorite destinations, and she was eager to make the journey as pleasant as possible for her passengers. As the business class passengers began to board, Anna greeted each one with a warm smile. "Welcome aboard," she said, her voice genuine and cheerful. "Please let me know if there's anything I can do to make your flight more comfortable." When the last passenger entered the cabin, Anna's breath caught in her throat. It was Mrs. Evelyn. Mrs. Evelyn was dressed in her signature understated style, her simple yet elegant outfit a reflection of her personality. She carried the same worn handbag that had caused so much judgment on the previous flight, but this time Anna saw it differently. To her, it was no longer a symbol of someone who didn't belong in business class. It was a symbol of resilience, of a woman who had built an empire with her own two hands. "Mrs. Evelyn," Anna said, her voice filled with both surprise and warmth. "It's so good to see you again." Mrs. Evelyn looked at Anna, her eyes twinkling with recognition. "Hello, Anna," she said, her tone kind. "It's good to see you too." Anna escorted Mrs. Evelyn to her seat, ensuring that she was comfortable and had everything she needed. As the flight progressed, Anna checked on her frequently, not out of obligation, but out of genuine care and respect. She wanted to show Mrs. Evelyn through her actions how much she had grown. Toward the end of the flight, Mrs. Evelyn called Anna over. "You've changed," she said simply, her gaze steady. Anna nodded, her heart pounding. "I have," she admitted, "and I have you to thank for that. You taught me a lesson I'll never forget." Mrs. Evelyn smiled, a warm, genuine smile that lit up her face. "Good," she said, "because the world needs more people who are willing to learn and grow. Keep going, Anna. You're on the right path." As the plane touched down in Paris, Anna felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't experienced in a long time. She had come a long way since that fateful flight, and she knew her journey was far from over.
But for the first time, she felt truly confident in the person she was becoming. For Mrs. Evelyn, the flight was another reminder of the power of compassion and the importance of standing up for what she believed in. She had spent her life building an airline, but her greatest legacy would always be the lessons she left behind. The lessons of respect, dignity, and the belief that every person, no matter their background, deserved to be treated with kindness. As the passengers disembarked, Anna stood at the door, her smile brighter than ever. When Mrs. Evelyn passed, she paused for a moment and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Evelyn, for everything." Mrs. Evelyn nodded, her eyes filled with warmth. "Thank you, Anna, for listening." And with that, she stepped off the plane, leaving behind not just a flight, but a legacy that would continue to inspire and transform, one journey at a time. Thank you so much for watching this video. Your time and support mean the world to us. If you found value in the content, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Stoic Mind Mastery for more inspiring and thought-provoking videos. Together, let's continue to grow, reflect, and master the art of living with wisdom and resilience. Your journey toward a stronger Stoic mindset starts here. Thank you for being a part of it.